Welcome learners, welcome to the course BSW 041 Understanding Tribals. This week we are going to discuss the block 2. So we will be discussing the topic today, the historical perspectives of tribal policies. Let us look at the objectives of this unit. In this unit we would be discussing the historical perspectives of tribal policies both before and after the colonial period. After going through the unit, the learner would be able to understand various policies for tribals in the colonial period, and also it will help the learner to examine the policies for tribals in the post-colonial period, and finally we will be discussing the draft national tribal policy. So in the first part we will be focusing on the various policies for tribals in the colonial period and post-colonial period. The colonial period in India began with the British colonizers entering India in the 18th century for trade and other commercial ventures. They observed economic and cultural diversity and heterogeneity in livelihood. Hence, they categorized the Indian population into certain habitational and occupational groups for their administrative convenience. The colonizers tried to develop these categories by way of providing education, health facilities and communication, and so as to bring them into the mainstream society. They also started implementing various laws, acts and policies for the development and benefits of these people. After decades of policies for tribals during the colonial period, and despite various constitutional provisions and acts, the plight on the tribals still persists. The following sections, the tribal policies of the colonial and post-colonial periods. Let us discuss the colonial and post-colonial periods. The post-colonial period is further divided into pre- and post-economic liberalization. The 11th 5-year plan and draft tribal national policy, which are part of the post-economic liberalization period, they are treated separately. Now let us look at the tribal policies during pre-independence period. The British attributed the backwardness and inferiority of the tribes to habitation structure and isolation of the people who were shy of coming to the mainstream society. Hence, they tried to bring them to the mainstream culture through certain policies. They engage revenue collectors, forest officials and local people to collect data pertaining to these people. The economic development of the people was a prime requisite of that period. The history of the forest policies reveals that interest in forestry was noticed as far back as 1806 with the reservation of teak forest in Malabar during the British period. It was done so with the supply of timber to England for the Royal Navy and other needs during the war with Napoleon. In course of time, because of unabated railways expansion in British India and lack of any supervision of the felling operation, there were great chunks of forest that was destroyed. The government became aware of rapid depletion of the forest due to such reckless and wasteful manner of forest operation by private enterprise. In the year 1862, the Governor General called for a Department of Forests to supply the required wooden sleeper for the railways. Thus, the British India witnessed the establishment of Forest Department in the year 1864 with the help of the German foresters. The practice of scientific forestry in India began with Mr. Dietrich Brandis, who took over the responsibility as the Inspector General of the Forest India in 1864. In the same year, Forest Department was established. Prior to this, the British had stopped the free movement of forest dwellers on the forest. And in the year 1865, the Forest Act of 1865 was enacted that empowered the government to appropriate any land covered with trees. However, notification could only be effected if existing rights of individuals and communities were not impinged upon. In the year 1878, another act was made which was particularly concerning with removing ambiguity about the absolute proprietary right of the state. The new act was designed to facilitate strict state control over forest resources and was distinctly annexionist in nature. So, in order to check the deforestation and for consolidation of the forest estate, the assertion of state monopoly right over forest was needed for this purpose. The need of a separate department was felt, and at the same time, the enactment of legislation was needed for its operation. So, such provisions were required to control the previously exercised unlimited rights of the users over the forest. This policy went against the tribals as well as non-tribal communities. In this way, the customary use of forest by villagers was not based on their rights but on a privilege which was being exercised at the mercy of the rulers. The loss of rights and the consequent loss of control over the natural resources agitated the forest dwellers, giving rise to revolts in tribal areas, and the people did not cooperate with the forest department. In fact, alienation of natural resources has been one of the main reasons for many tribal rebellions in the past as well as in the present. This also gave rise to another fact that the people who were taking care of the forest for their existence, when it became the ruler's property, turned passive in its protection. Consequently, a settlement over forest was carried out in the year 1880. The first forest policy was issued and declared in the year 1894, following the recommendation of Dr. Weicker, who was a German expert. And this policy emphasized the basic issues like the public benefit, preservation of climate and physical condition of the country, commercial neutralization of the timber and of the state revenue, checking of the encroachment of the forest land for cultivation and use of forest in the interest of local population, etc. But it is a fact that no act has been mentioned about the tribe and their access to forest resources. It was only the National Forest Policy in the year 1988 in which the Adivasi forest rights was mentioned, which introduced contractors, traders and non-tribal laborers to forest areas in a substantial manner. The Indian Forest Act of 1927 recognized concessions and privileges of the forest dwelling tribal people and peasants in respect of cultivation, grazing of animals, collection of firewood and timbers for household consumption, raw materials for crafts, mining and quarrying of stone, hunting and fishing gathering. So, besides those with regard to employment and other services. The colonial governments, including the Dutch and the Portuguese, entered India for trade and commerce. However, due to communication constraint, it was difficult for them to export goods and materials, particularly forest resources from India. So, it was necessary for them to construct railway lines so as to make their commerce viable. Later on, they enacted Land Acquisition Act in the year 1894 to have a control over both the public and private land. This act envisaged that acquiring of land for some public purpose by government or government agency as authorized by the law from the individual landowners after paying government fixed compensation in lieu of losses incurred by landowners due to surrendering of his or their land to the concerned government agency. The state still follows even after independence for the construction of dams and setting up of mining and industries in the tribal areas. The rulers of the colonial period realized the difficulties in administration in the far-flung tribal areas irrespective of the acceptance of policy of isolation or segregation. The isolation of the tribals, it was felt, would keep them away from political interference which was catching momentum at that time. Another assumption was that the tribals were better and happier in their natural surrounding and traditional socio-cultural milieu. It was further realized that isolation would protect the tribal against the hostility and exploitation which they found on the increase. As isolationists, the British position declared certain contiguous and thickly populated tribal belts as excluded and partially excluded areas. The policy of isolation was supported by then separatist anthropologists who advocated for tribal reserves. For them, isolation broadly referred to phenomenon where a group of people or communities was disconnected from other communities and resided in remote pockets having their own distinct ways of life. It could be in a relative form, complete form, or partial form. So, subscribing to isolation, Elwin in the year 1939, he suggested the establishment of the national park theory. National park theory, this already we have discussed in unit 1 from block 1. Within the framework of policy of isolation, the creation of excluded and partially excluded areas, some legislations were enacted. For example, Innerline Regulation in the year 1873, which aimed at controlling trades and industries in the tribal areas of Northeast and restricting transfer of tribal land to non-tribals who are coming from outside and thereby to curb land alienation. With the restrained entry into their interior tribal settlements, the other channels of exploitation such as money lending would also be curbed. So, the basic idea was to keep tribals away from the people coming from more advanced communities. The protection and preservation of tribal life and culture were ensured by the Scheduled District Act of 1874 that provided for special tribal administration. This excluded the tribal areas from the operation of ordinary laws of the country. The exclusion of the backward tracts from the jurisdiction of provincial government was also suggested by Monte Chelmsford report of 1918. Showing increasing concern of the tribal affairs and to protect tribal heritages, the tribal areas were divided into wholly excluded areas and area of modified exclusion. This was according to the Government of India Act 1919. Under the Government of India Act 1935, these areas were regrouped as excluded and partially excluded areas. On the eve of the independence, it was decided to put all the tribal communities in a separate schedule of the Constitution of India. Thus, the excluded and partially excluded areas were enlisted in 5th and 6th schedule. The areas inhabited by scheduled tribes were termed as scheduled areas, agency areas. These areas are specially defined in para 6 of the part C of the 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Although the genesis of the concept of the scheduled area was traced back to the Scheduled District Act of 1874 in the pre-independence period, the scheduled areas were retained to assist the tribals in enjoying customary right without exploitation and to develop and protect the tribes and their environment. As I said earlier, the tribal populated areas were divided into excluded and partially excluded areas under the 5th and 6th schedules. The states except Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram are administered under 5th schedule of the Constitution and the remaining states were under the 6th schedule. Articles 244 and 275 are especially meant for the 6th schedule areas that were later reformed as scheduled districts. This kind of formation by Verrier Elwin also made special provisions for the tribes of northeastern India. The tribes of Arunachal Pradesh find special attention in Elwin's book A Philosophy of NEFA, that is Northeast Frontier Agency. In the post-independence period, the NEFA, that is the Northeast Frontier Agency, visualized land in 3 Jum land regulations in identical terms for the 3 frontier tracts separately. With regard to the forest policy, the Assam Forest Regulation was enacted. Communal land system prevailed in one form or the other in all the states of Northeast, but remained inoperative only in Tripura. The Manipur State Hill People Regulation 1947 envisages the right to enjoy land within the boundaries of their village. The Arunachal Pradesh in the Land Settlement and Record Act in 2000 is a denouncement of the concept of terra nullius, that means the traditional rights on land used by community. In this act, a community is perceived as a legal person only in a nominalistic manner. The Jum land regulation recognized residents of a village as a whole, the clan, sub-clan, phratry or kindred as a community. Now let us look at what are the tribal policies during the post-independence period. In the post-independent period, the British policy of isolation was shifted to the integration model of tribal development. So various conventional programs were started in the tribal areas so as to meet the constitutional commitment and for bringing about social and economic change among the tribal people. New 9 direct and indirect measures were imposed to promote the integration of tribal. The British protective legislations and their after effect in certain parts of tribal India could not be found compatible with the democratic traditions, socialisms and integrations proposed in independent India. The then Honorable Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who was concerned about formulating a tribal policy, said, "I have no doubt that the development and change and so-called progress will come to them because it is becoming increasingly difficult for any people to live their isolated life cut off from rest of the world. But let this development and change be natural and be in the nature of self-development with all the help one can give in the process." V. Elvin, a pronounced anthropologist, worked among the Indian tribes and closely associated with Nehru, made a tremendous contribution to the tribal development policies. In his disputed isolationist approach, Nehru insisted that tribal should maintain a selective distance from the mainstream socio-political and economic system, which was, however, not applicable to the Nehruvian patriotism. So Elvin changed his notion of isolationism to integrationism. Based on his integrationist model, Nehru gave the policy of Panchi. The main features of the policy were tribal people should develop along the lines of their own genius and we should avoid imposing anything on them. We should try to encourage in every way their own traditional arts and culture. Tribal people's right in land and forest should be respected. We should try to train and build up a team of their own people and to do the work for administration and development. We should not over-administer these areas or overwhelm with them with a multiplicity of schemes. We should rather work through and not in rivalry with their social and cultural institutions. We should judge results not by statistics or the amount of money spent, but the quality of human character that is evolved. So after independence, a new forest policy was formulated in the year 1952 as a modification of the previous forest policies that more or less emphasized upon the destruction of forest or ecological deterioration. The forest policy in the year 1952 encouraged the formation of forest development committees in different states of India to check the commercialization of forest resources. In report of the Committee on Forest and Tribals in India in the year 1982, there were some new lights which have been thrown towards the forest-based rights of the country. The report was prepared under the chairmanship of B.K. Roy Burman, an Indian anthropologist, and as such anthropologists' viewpoints are duly reflected in the recommendations. At the outset of the report, he wrote a letter to Sri P.C. Sethi, the Honorable Minister of Home Affairs, Government of India, saying that there is a symbiotic relationship between the tribal social organization and forest economy in the specific historical context of our country. Further, the overwhelming majority of the populations living in forest are tribal communities, and that they are not only forest dwellers but also they have evolved a way of life which on the one hand is woven around forest ecology and forest resources, and on the other ensure that the forest is protected against depredation by man and nature. He emphasized that there cannot be any development of forest without development of the forest dwelling tribal communities. The committee also recommended that the symbiosis between the tribal communities and the forest management should be established through imaginative forestry programs and conservation and reorganization of traditional skill of labor. Just after independence, 5-year plans were initiated making target for development of certain specific projects including tribal development so as to make them integrated into the mainstream societies. or thereby making their own destinies of self-development by getting rid of exploitation by non-tribals. In pursuance of this, tribal development policies were framed in different consecutive 5-year plans of the Planning Commission. Let us look at what are the 5-year plans. So, in the first 5-year plan, from the year 1951 to 56, there was no special attempts made except introducing certain schemes on education and welfare. The schemes under this sector were meant to supplement the general development efforts for the backward classes, including tribal populations. In the second 5-year plan, from 1956 to 61, 43, that is special multipurpose tribal blocks were established in the scheduled area, and the program of each block were given an additional thrust by siphoning a special allocation of rupees 15 lakhs for 5 years. The DBAR Commission in the year 1960 to 61 was appointed to study the whole gamut of tribal development. The DBAR Commission recommendations have gone a long way to strengthen the protective shield and giving Panchayat Raj a tribal bias, besides taking a comprehensive and integrated view of tribal development. The DBAR Commission also recommended establishment of tribal cultural research and training institutes in states for conducting training for official and non-official development functionaries and workers taking part in research studies, so that their results can be used as feedback in planning and administration. During the third 5-year plan, that is from the year 1961 to 69, on the basis of second 5-year plan, 415 tribal development blocks were set up to improve the conditions of tribal areas and to involve tribal people in the process of development with the aid of Panchayat institutions as well. Priorities were in the order of economic upliftment, education, health, housing and communication. In the fifth 5-year plan, that is from the year 1974 to 78, 3 categories, namely area of tribal concentration, dispersed tribals and primitive tribal groups were given attention. Problems of the mentioned categories were emphasized. The basic approach towards tribal development adopted in the fifth plan was mainly to identify larger areas of tribal concentration, which included the scheduled areas, contiguous tribal development blocks and other backward regions having 50% tribal concentration. In the sixth 5-year plan from 1980 to 85, it was noticed that certain pockets of tribal concentration outside the tribal sub-plan area were still left out of the tribal sub-plan strategy. It was decided during the sixth plan that pockets of center group villages, pockets having a minimum of 10,000 tribal population, of which at least 50% are scheduled tribes, should be carved for intensive integrated development and modified area development approach under the tribal sub-plan. And in the seventh plan from the year 1985 to 90, the objective remained to be a mix of area cum family development. Simultaneously, attention was given to the vulnerable sections amongst the scheduled tribes, and can easily be ascertained that their resources was mainly based on environmental devastation. So, we have come to the end, learners. Let us meet in the next session with part 2. Thank you.